Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Philly Brutes Rugby Roundtable. I didn't realise I was going to do it again, but then when you got two absolute gentlemen want to come and have an argument about a tournament that doesn't quite exist yet, you can't not say no. So I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by the Rugby Journal's Alex Mead and the one and only broadcaster, Saturday night primetime television extraordinaire, my son's favourite game show, Mr. Nick Heath. How are you, gentlemen?
Yeah, very good, mate. Very good.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Sean. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Back in the saddle. Didn't realise I was going to be podcasting again or doing anything like this, but you guys cool.
Is the 18-month-old down? Are we clear?
He is, yeah. He's asleep. He is asleep in the next room.
So, I mean, in fairness, your whole thing is about getting rugby players on pitches, isn't it? You've had nothing to do for the last 18 months. You've just been setting your feet up, and now at last, your actual purpose, the work starts.
I've created a social network, which we'll talk about later on down the line. I've got my own social network.
It's called the Book Face.
Sorry?
It's called the Book Face.
Yeah, the Book Face, yeah. You can go and register now if you want at FYB.rugby.com, but we'll save that for another day. So today we're going to have a little chat about something that came out in the last 48, 72 hours, perhaps, the World 12s. Another innovative format that World Rugby may or may not need. It was announced the other day to some fanfare, I guess, and from their press release, a new World 12s rugby tournament launches, aiming to bring £250 million into the global game. Well, I'm sure we'll get to that. A brand new annual tournament targets new fans through innovative shortened format. Consultation with key global rugby stakeholders has begun. Players to be selected for 8 franchise teams via auction, very IPL. The inaugural tournament will be staged in England ahead of the 2022-23 season, with the women's tournament planned for 2023. So, gents, we'll just start with, what was the initial thought when you saw this come out from Neil Fizzler the other day, and then it was announced 24 hours later? Alex, your initial thoughts before you even saw any press release, video?
It's the same again, isn't it? And like, I mean, the thing is even then, there's so many points even on that thing. It's like I want to pull apart every single element of it, but it's not even the game for me. It's like, you know, I'm a back. I love like shortened versions of the game. I love sevens, and I could even see Rugby X. I like the idea that Rugby X, I know a lot of people had a criticism, but I was like, this isn't for us. But I could see that the razzmatazz behind it, flashing lights, stuff like that. I could totally see
Rugby X as being
I could totally see how my son would like it. Yeah, I could totally see it, and I think it's very hard. But whenever anything gets launched onto Twitter, and it did because someone fed Neil Fizzler the information, and Fizzler's got a certain audience, it's going to get pulled apart, and maybe that's the reason they did it. But then it shouldn't launch with no substance behind it. Do you know what it feels like? You know when you get those emails that say, win thousands of pounds, it's got like really hot girls, really this, and that's what it feels like. Because if those players, if you had a picture of Redrada, Smith, and Bowden Barrett, you'd be like, whoa, okay, get it. If the franchises weren't the words franchise, it would be the London Bulls wearing a night kit with someone in. You'd think, okay, that's cool. If the 250,000 was like MasterCard, you know, if underneath it all, it was like supported by World Rugby, you think, yeah, okay, great. But instead, it feels literally some old guys in a pub think, do you know what rugby needs? Or not in a pub, they'd be like a private members guard, maybe the Exchange or somewhere, I don't know. And they'll be saying, right, what we need is another version. Yeah, great. Well, let's go through it. Let's work it out. No, 13, no, can't, no. 12, yeah, that sort of works. Well, how do we? Well, my mate's got this money. My mate's got knows Ian Ritchie. Great. Let's get the fucking A team together. And you have a bunch of 60-somethings coming together saying what the new generation of rugby fans, who we don't know who they are, and they've not told us who they are, which they should know, because you don't launch a product without a market. And that's what they just put it out there with no substance. And that is the issue. It's not even the fact. I would like 12s. I'm sure I would. But I just don't think any of those guys there, and even in Richie, who has got the background in communication, but he's 5 years out of that job now. And even then, when you get to the CEO, it doesn't mean you're the person who's got your finger on the pulse. If they had launched and said, what rugby needs is this, if there was a video that said, you know, why do we get 9 million watching Six Nations or whatever it is, and yet none of that, or a fraction of that translates to the club game. And it's because they want the national rivalry. Okay, well, that's one thing you can bring in, or it's because of the sense of occasion, or it's the timing, or whatever. But there's nothing behind it. And even just saying they've got the money, you know, we can all do. We've seen this in rugby so many times. Someone comes along. How many clubs have had a mystery backer that's pulled out? And I just wasn't convinced, and I don't understand why they did it the way they did it. Other than someone actually did say to me on Twitter about an American example where they did this. There was no substance behind it, but they did it to shake it up in the hope that if it got a positive reaction, then they could get backers on board. But I just feel they should know Twitter better than that, and know that Twitter is occupied by people that isn't the target audience anyway, but will pull it apart before it even gets to the target audience. So it's about the approach, and a lot of this is with my marketing head on. So my actual day-to-day job is, we've got an agency called Sporting Eric, and we do marketing, and my background was a publicist. We would never launch a product to a client without saying, look, here's all the research that says about your client. This is what you should say. This is how you should say it. And it feels very basic. And yet rugby does this time and again. But yeah, I mean, even when Bristol did change their name, I'm not saying it was perfect, because they also did some poetry about bears. Do you remember? They sort of said, the bear emerged, which is probably works in a changing room, but does not work on Twitter with a load of folks talking about how the bear comes out of hibernation. But they did a really good document that said, we want to target Asia and America. This is what the bear means. This is where we're going. You're like, do you know what? That's a proper strategy. That is a plan. Who cares if, you know, XYZ on Twitter doesn't like it? They're not the audience. But there was just none of it behind it, really. That was, so yeah, so it was more from the strategic side for me, and a bit of frustration of here we go again, and our lives are wasted. And I very rarely write blogs and stuff, but I really felt compelled, because it really annoyed me about the way in which we keep doing it. And so much money must have got spent even on pulling those figures together for that slightly rubbish motion graphic that said nothing.
And before we pull it apart, Nick, what were sort of the initial thoughts from your side on another new format?
Yeah, The Case for the Prosecution by Alex Mead.
I rest.
I think certainly no money was spent on the logo. I'll certainly say that much. I mean, you know, I think there's, I think there is a lot we don't know. I think there are question marks around where the investment's coming from or whatever. I think there is probably, Alex, I think you're probably right. It probably isn't a million miles away from presenting something that hasn't quite got all the investment necessarily and hasn't quite got all the interest. But if we come out of the woods and show at least as far as we've got to with the people on board, then it might generate some interest. So I don't, you know, I think while that is a sort of potentially cynical or interesting ploy, I think it probably is a strategy in some senses that has some opportunity for success. I think, you know, for me, firstly, the format of 12s initially, 6 and 6. Okay, now I think, as I said on Twitter, you've got a 50-22 law that's in at the minute to try and drop wingers into the backfield to support a fullback so that there's more room at the front of the field. You're effectively creating a 12-on-12 scenario there in the sort of middle third of a rugby field. I think, yeah, I have to show my hand. I worked on the World Tens last year, and potentially could do again in the future if it makes its return. But what I learned through that process and being fairly close to the entrepreneurial investors who were behind it and hearing a lot of their thinking is that rugby as a market absolutely desperately calling out to be disrupted. World Rugby have almost a monopoly on the game. It's not that they're just a governing body, but they're very quick to stop unions, new competitions coming up with ideas in some areas, and so there are competitions. I'm aware of 2 or 3 other ideas waiting in the wings, whether it's women's stuff, men's stuff, shorter formats or whatever, that are trying to get their ducks in a row to be able to come to market. And some of them have a view on talking to World Rugby and wanting to get their approval and making sure they're doing things right. And others, particularly where the World Tens were concerned, well, they worked out that whatever a regulation rugby pitch is 80 meters to 100 meters. Well, what if we make our 79 meters? Does that mean it's a pitch in a truly rugby union sense? What if we change this rule and this rule? Well, actually, at what point does this become closer to rugby league's jurisdiction than rugby unions and World Rugby? So then, are you creating a different sport that you can then own, that you can then go to franchisees and people and players can step out of under the all-powerful World Rugby Union bubble and choose to come and play, albeit it's the over ball game that we do know and love and is effectively rugby, but technically and perhaps legally steps outside of where someone might have something to say about it. I certainly loved Martin Cross's reaction on Twitter that showed the picture of Ian Ritchie and said, this is just the image and strategy to try and attract new young people to the game. I think we need to be careful when they talk about wanting to reach new fans as to how much of that is a keenness to be getting Gen Z on board. I'm sure it is, and there is interest there, but they may have just as much interest in capturing everybody else who, up to the age of 75 or whatever, who has fallen out of love with how technical, how pained on every ref decision and TMO rugby has become, and actually would love to re-engage with a format that is a lot slicker, that is a lot smoother, that doesn't have as many scrum resets, all of this kind of thing. So while I'm not necessarily sure whether a 12s game looks a whole lot different to 15s. I think losing a couple more players and going to 10s does start to allow more hybrid athletes onto the field, and therefore you can change the spectacle and the speed of the game. I think there's probably some number crunching that has been done. There probably have been, the likes of Ian Ritchie, Steve Chew, Gareth Davis. They're not the sorts of people to necessarily have been doing this on a punt. And I dare say that they've had sufficient conversations about what the format could be. They have probably done. I'm not going to disagree with what Alex has suggested, because I think part of it's probably right. They have probably gone to people who may invest in this. But there are, and I know from the World Tens experience, there are massive global sporting stars from American sports, basketball, football, everywhere, who are really keen on any kind of market that wants to disrupt. The IPL is worth $500 million. Rugby can't get close to the kind of numbers that they're trying to that IPL can value itself at. If you can create a product that starts to get worldwide franchise investment, you're capable of blowing our 15s game out of the water in terms of the investment, the money it can make. And I do sense that there are quite a few people in the shadows wanting to come out and do it. Is this going to be the winner? I've no idea. It could be dead in the water in 6 months. I couldn't say. But I certainly don't meet it with the same amount of cynicism that everyone else has had, because I'm aware that there are people that are very keen to disrupt this market and say, well, actually, we've got a product here we think can really work with investment, with some major backers on board, and they are going to throw NFL salaries at rugby players for the first time ever in their lives. And all the talk of, but the unions won't release them or the clubs won't release them. They won't have to. The players will jack that in. There won't be any interest in that side, and they'll go and play their last 3-4 years in this new competition, absolutely line their boots and be on the world stage, on TV all over the world. And if that could be where this goes, and that is where the investment is, then I think that's really exciting.
I think this exact conversation could have happened in 1995, and that's everything you've just said is exactly the Kerry Packer story, where even Kerry Packer, whose name gets put next to it, didn't really do much. It was this one guy going around getting these players. We had all the conversations, every single, Mike Rea, I think, told me he was going to Boston. All these Welsh guys were there, and then the South Africans ultimately signed for South Africa, and that ruined everything. And that's why the cynicism exists. And because this one doesn't have any more substance, and it actually amazes me. And the problem is, you've also got a bunch of 60-year-old white blokes coming out and saying, we're going to launch the women next year, though. We're only going to do 8 sides, but the one area of growth that we've currently got in rugby, we're not going to bother for another year because that's
it is a World Cup next year. So
yeah, but then wait. So why try to like jump ahead and steal the limelight from the Women's Rugby World Cup when you could wait a year, do it properly? Maybe when you've got a logo, maybe when you've got a sponsor, maybe you've got an idea, maybe you've got names of teams, maybe you've got some players, maybe you've not just made a figure out of air. And like, I don't necessarily, I'm not entirely sure that guys who are retired wouldn't just get on board with an idea anyway, because why not? If you offer me enough cash and I'm 68 years old, I'll put my name to something, like why not? Just to ruffle a few feathers. And I think that's the thing. And I think that's why it was so badly done, because I made the point again, also about Richie, that nobody knows who this guy is in the wider world. He's just an old boy in a shirt holding a nondescript rugby ball. Like I said, it would have made a world of difference if all of that was tidy, but it just feels like a massive punt. And I also don't know how dissolute the rugby game is declining at grassroots level with the men's, etc. Not because of the complexity of the games, just because the world's got bigger. And I think it's very easy to marry on what we see on social media with a decline, because ultimately, even the Lions still got good engagement, despite there being no crowds, there being not sure if it's happening. It's still got a lot of attention. So I'm not sure people are as disengaged with the game as they think, because you only have to look at the Harlequins final. I don't even like Harlequins. I'm a Chiefs fan, but Jesus Christ, hats off to them. That's rugby, and no one's disillusioned. Yeah, don't look. I've said enough. Don't make me change. But you see the sevens at World Cup with the Olympics, Fiji. I don't know if people are as disillusioned. I just think social media, people get lost in those conversations. I mean, I try to avoid getting embroiled in conversations about rules and the breakdown and things like that as much as I can, because it's just a never-ending pit of despair, to be honest.
I think mentioning social media is interesting, though, because I don't think the likes of Richie and Steve Chu are spending any time at all on Twitter wondering what the reaction is. They're out there canvassing and doing what they can, and probably getting hold of investors on that front. And I think there's also the side of what that money is and where that's coming from, and I think this may be one of the reasons that they've made the move that they had, because my experience with World Tens was you move far enough to show that enough of the basics have been considered. I appreciate we may not have seen all of that yet, but you then talk about the numbers and the interest that you've got. You then can be looking at the commercial value of it. And I know that by the time the Tens was taking place last year, they were getting phone calls from the directors and CEOs of major sports ownership bodies saying how much for a franchise. And over the course of a couple of days, the valuation on those franchises went up tenfold. And all of a sudden they were talking about £1 million franchises or $1 million franchises. And the thing had only been in existence for about a week in terms of an active product. And so there is a way to do it. I'm interested because, having seen a lot of the inner workings and also been part of the kind of social side of it on the World Tens last year, as to how they managed to sort of slowly and softly launch themselves and actually have a live product that seemed, from what I could tell, and I know I was in a bit of an echo chamber, but it seemed to curry a bit of favor. People seemed to think, do you know what, this is a bit different. I've quite enjoyed it. I'm not entirely sure about it, but it certainly didn't seem to create the offense levels that this launch and press announcement has made this week. And I'm wondering what the major difference is there, because we only had another short format mentioned and exposed last year. It didn't seem to get the animosity that this has.
I think a lot of them do, don't they? I mean, Rugby X got a lot of stick, and the World Tens. I think people feel like World Tens has been part of the Hong Kong Tens is one of the most famous events out there. So I think it just fits. But I also think rugby has got so many
format that people play at grassroots level in tournaments all the time.
Yeah, and I think there's other issues. Like where should our
investment
be
in a sevens tournament either? But I can't say I've ever played in a 12s tournament.
Well, I know a lot of people who think that World Rugby actually backed the wrong horse by choosing 7s over 10s when they did. I think a lot of people feel that 7s then has created athletes that don't really have a place in the rest of the game necessarily. So actually 10s would have been a better hybrid version for there to be more of that traditional grassroots sense of rugby, which is a game for all shapes and sizes, which these days, certainly towards the higher level, is not really the case, except in a few Cheslin Colby examples.
I guess you want everyone to kind of, rather than having 6 half-baked ideas, do something really good that's special, that makes a difference. Like, put that money into the women's game and create professional club rugby for that, and do it properly, because we're still struggling with men's rugby. Like, put the money somewhere where it's going to really make a difference, as opposed to there being all these pockets of different money and different ideas, and everyone thinking that rugby's this huge cash cow. Like, why do they think it's a cash cow? None of our clubs make money. None of the regions don't seem to work.
Even where CBC is concerned, I'm like, you guys are obviously very clever at what you do, and you've been into F1 and made a ton of money, but I'm still sat here on the sidelines going, can you really make money out of rugby? Because most of the time people have proved that not to be the case.
Well, I kind of feel the same, and we're all waiting for it. And I've interviewed owners and said, well, when CVC do their thing, I said, what the fuck is their thing? And F1, tell me exactly, because as far as I was aware, F1 was always freaking massive. Yeah, I always had the cigarette brands, always had the biggest brands in the world were in F1. And I'm sure there's going to be loads of people who tell me what they did, but I do want to know the plan, because
the Premiership clubs also been given their CVC pocket money, and they've probably all spent it on freshening up the toilets and putting a new lick of paint on the stands, and all of a sudden they're like, that didn't last very long. I'm not convinced on that front. I think it'll be interesting to see what sort of, how the next few stages go with this, because they talk about wanting to attract the big names, and they're going to have to put those feelers out and find out who they can get. And while the World Tens was able to snare a few of the sort of more well-knowns, the Ben Fodens of the world in MLR to come and play in Bermuda last year, there were other conversations with plenty of players. Chris Robshaw was very close to playing there. They've spoken to Matt Gitto. They've spoken to Drew Mitchell. Quite a lot of people were keen from the Southern Hemisphere, but they from Australia and New Zealand, they simply couldn't travel because of where the pandemic was. And where the Sevens players were, having been cut loose by their unions pre-Olympics, a lot of them were feeling, well, I'm fairly persona non grata here, and maybe while they're going to look at doing a short-term contract potentially for us when we do return pre-Olympics, maybe we actually now want to look at a world where we then don't get put on a massive, or not a massive, a 30 grand annual contract or whatever it might be. We turn around and say, we're very happy to be on this contract for 9 months of the year, but for the other bit, we want to be free to go and do what we do elsewhere. And that there may be a slight change in the playing market for players and professionals who can go, well, okay, I'm now going to play an MLR season from the end of March to the beginning of August. I'll then go and play some 12s, some 10s, some 4s, and then perhaps go and pick up a contract from January in the Premiership when half the team are injured, and I can go in and get paid 40 grand to finish off the season. And actually, I've had my best earning year by being available and effectively a professional rugby freelancer. And I know there were quite a few of the certainly the Sevens boys and others that were saying this could be a way to go if more and more of these private equity competitions start springing up.
So no different to being a cricketer these days, I guess. Then.
Yeah, exactly.
You go from IPL to Big Bash to then come over here to play either the Blast or now the 100.
Yeah,
and you become just a globetrotter.
Yeah, which enhances your value, and all those drafts have an even bigger stake then, because you're continuing to add value to yourself as a proper commodity. And
I think if maybe you start that. If there was some, it'd be almost better if someone said, what, rugby isn't working. We all tried and we had a good crack at it, but it's not working. Too many people aren't getting paid enough. The second tiers aren't working, and there's only so much money. So we're going to rip it all up. And what we reckon is actually feasible is that 10 aside, this many teams per country, all those get professional, a bit like in F1. Everyone else goes back to amateur and stay in your regions, and actually that might give us a sustainable future, because what we're doing now, I'd almost That'd be more believable, because what the other option is the idea of all of those different parts. We have literally got a world where we've got a southern hemisphere and northern hemisphere with different weathers, which should be perfectly complementing each other because they're different parts of the world, you know, different climates. But we can't agree that, you know. So
it's the equivalent of a city like London expanding organically and being all on top of each other and everywhere, and being able to build a nice new town and a new world and have a grid system, isn't it? There was no opportunity to build this perfectly from the way things started. So yeah, I agree with you. It would be lovely to completely restart, but yeah, we're not in that world.
But you'd almost believe that if people like Chu and Richie said, look, we know how rugby works financially. We know that it doesn't work financially. We know that whilst all that money gets pumped there, all that happens is the money gets thinner and thinner, whilst ultimately the competition with other sports, with other entertainment, means that there's less and less people. So actually, here's a blueprint for the future that will make it sustainable, because everyone's clinging on to their own thing. And you know, we know our own problems with the Premiership. We're now trying to, rather than trying to look at the nation in Premiership rugby and say, where are the gaps? Let's make clubs there. We take the women's clubs and put them into the same place where the men's are also failing, so that we can collectively fail together, rather than saying, do you know what? Let's have a women's team in Cornwall because they need a side and make them Prem, and let's have the men's side in Exeter because that's two different audiences. Maybe collectively they could get a bigger audience, but instead we'll ask the same people to play more games. So there's not much collective thinking that goes on when it comes to these visions. So yeah. I would almost believe it more if there was a great blueprint, but there was just nothing. It was
I think the thing is, the closest version to redrawing it and trying to put a new blueprint on it has been the CVC side, because if you can get CVC investing in all of the people that are arguing over the garden fence every year to a line, and you go, will you do what we want if we give you a whole pile of cash? Right, that's you on side. That's you. Right, Six Nations. Yeah. And they've clearly gone around to try and do that. But when you then see the difference in something like the Premiership, and I spoke to someone well placed or someone who was in Prem Rugby last year, and they said the problem with the CVC money is that it used to be that Premiership Rugby existed to best serve the club for the product, whereas now Premiership Rugby exists to best serve CVC, and there is a subtle difference there. But I can imagine that is how that there are major differences, therefore, in how certain decisions are made and taken. So I think, yeah, there's clearly money can be put in to try and solve problems, but it also creates problems of its own at the same time.
Well, because the only solution is to create a monopoly. And the same conversation happens when I hear people talk about wanting a rugby channel with everything on. Totally makes sense for us as the consumer, but what it creates is a monopoly, which means that everyone, yeah, come on board, buy our product, cost you like 10 quid a year. Now, fuck it, quid, have it. And then eventually everyone goes on board and they realize, got you all now, got rid of all the competition. Now we're going to charge you 200 quid a month. And that's market forces. And that's what, you know, like you said, if CVC, if it was then, if they're the 250 million quid, then you say, oh, well, there's a plan here. And like you said, Nick, yeah, it all folds neatly together, but you just know that's not the case. It's someone taking a punt.
Do you not think, in terms of a strategy, they're at least able to say, look, we've got a thing over here, and we've got a, don't worry, there's a thing, but there's got to be a level of non-transparency in order for them to be able to keep certain interested parties at bay without suddenly 25 journalists ringing them and going, I hear you're doing a thing in rugby, what's this about? Now, like, we're not really ready to talk about it yet. I don't mind the fact that we don't know all the detail yet.
Well, you'd think they'd be a bit further down the line, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you have a player?
They just might not be telling us.
But you'd have a like, you know, the marketing side of it would be like, well, let's make it look a little bit less shit. Like, let's just name cities. Say, like, we're gonna have 8 cities rather than 8 franchises, and we're gonna it's gonna be the London Bulls, or it's gonna be this, and like, maybe, you know, I just think you've got to be a bit further down the line, because otherwise all it's doing is literally this. And I think that's where the cynicism, it's not cynicism, it's not even that people think, I know there are people who are pulling apart the format. I'm not doing that. Like, I don't, you know, I love 15s and I love 7s, and I love, you know, I can see the value in all the different formats. I'm not criticizing the format. I'm criticizing the way in which they approach things, and that even with those names there, I want to see more of a strategy before or anything. I just want to see some substance, because it's just.
It may be also though that they've decided to come out of the woods because they need to get a steal on anybody else who's lining themselves up in the wings as well. That I think could be a realistic scenario, because as soon as you say we're the 12, we're coming in August 2022, people go, wow, we were planning to come out and do that in 6 months and tell people about. So anyone else who now makes that move is going to seem, secondary to it, and ultimately so many things I've heard are launching in 22 or 23, so including the global world calendar by the time we get there. So it may be that they wanted to come out with as much as they could throw at the wall and make stick with everyone and tell us. But I get where you're coming from in terms of the information and how polished it actually has looked. It reminds me of a quote from an old show I watched years ago, which was, "What you've done is fall somewhere short of mediocre."
The only thing I can sort of really relate this to is the owner of WWE, Vince McMahon, in 2001 launched an American Football League to counter the NFL, because the NFL at the time had massive decline in ratings. WWE was the most popular television show in the world at the time. He launched his own American Football League called the XFL, and all he did was launch a logo and a ball. Had this glitzy press conference, and he didn't give any details, nothing. He couldn't. So he off the back of, it's a brilliant ESPN 30 for 30 as well. If you go, he got a phone call from Dick Ebersol, the founder of NBC Sports, in the car on the way home from the press conference, said, "I'll put all the money up." So maybe, and then in 2017 he did it again. He relaunched the XFL again with just a logo and just a ball. They played half a season because of COVID, and they sold it to The Rock and his people for almost $1 billion.
Right then. So who's designing the logo, and when are we holding the press conference?
Yeah,
this is it. I should have just kept quiet. I should, let's just launch something. Money will come somewhere.
Exactly. I love the idea.
We've got designers and good video people,
franchisees.
Yeah, I love the way this has turned into a brainstorming issue to come up with the next short format rather than.
I've already got the survey out to all those Six Nations fans. I'll put it out now, waiting for all the results, and then I'll we'll launch. Nick, you can do the voice of it, no problem.
They've announced today that they've already had conversations with potential franchise owners in the last 24 hours.
Yeah,
so perhaps it was a case of, we're going to launch a logo and we're going to launch a concept. We're going to throw it out there, and we're going to find out what happens. Because in 6 months' time, nothing happens. It can fizzle out, and all we've done is launch the logo.
Yeah, I dare say that's exactly part of it, because it wouldn't surprise me if the same people who were picking up the phone to the 10s last year are picking up the phone now to the 12s and saying, we're the people behind this massive international football team, or this global NHL franchise or NFL franchise, whatever it is. And so there's definitely a side to that. But it's very nice to be able to say, we've got 10 people, we've got over 10 people who've spoken to us, hoping that actually those first 10 people are going to call in the next 24 hours because that's your PR strategy. But
and then once they've got all the money, they'll ask the 10 fans that have signed up to their database who are going to form the. They say, guys, Sean, what the fuck are we going to do now? We've got the money. She's got no idea what to do with this. None of the players are signed up. The coaches won't. The unions are against us. We're not even sure we can use the name rugby. What are we going to do?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, well, I'll sign up. I'll sign up
in the press release. Look, and as I said, I haven't read too much because I kind of wanted to avoid it. A bit like the 100 until I saw it. They don't use the word rugby in the press conference, press release much at all. So is that a ploy?
It does call it new World 12s rugby tournament launches. But I know that language was something.
The press release is probably mentioned 4 times.
Yeah, I know that the 10s were quite quite keen to observe their language quite carefully in terms of what they called certain things. Are we calling it a try? Are we calling it a touchdown? There was a fair amount of discussion of these things because, like I said earlier, how much do you need and do you remain dancing to the beat of the drum that comes out of Dublin? And how much do you take an opportunity to do your own thing? And how much does it start to come into a monopoly legal battle if you're saying, well, we've come up with a new product that has the chance to reach new audiences, and we may use some of the players that currently exist in rugby union, and you're trying to stop us doing this? Is that actually allowed? So it's a complex issue on many fronts, and yeah, so I think it'll be interesting. And it's also people saying, 192 players, and where they're not going to get a whole load of global stars. Well, my experience last year was if you get 2 or 3 per team, then actually you're really interested to see how they get on, and you're interested to see who the other people are and how they're playing. And I got familiar with a whole load of players last year that it was quite good fun to watch, but also to see how much Dan Norton and Tom Mitchell could help combine with a couple of lesser known players. And actually that age-old question is a player who's seemingly a 4 out of 10, but you put them in a team full of 9 and 10s out of 10, actually turns out that they're a 7 or 8 out of 10. And it was just
I might get a gig.
They were in a poor team.
It's just also hard to get without the big players though. It's hard to get people behind the teams.
Well, yeah, it is.
And I think the 100 had that, didn't it? The 100 only let the test match players, so the players that are playing on the televisions week in, week out for England, only played on the first weekend. So you were brought in by your Ben Stokeses and guys like that, and then it was kind of, well, now you have to find out about these new guys and girls.
Yeah.
So I think it's not necessarily a bad thing, is it?
I think people are willing to do so, and I think there would be, between MLR players, people out of Super Rugby season, those who may not feel they've got a major role to play in the new Premiership season starting in September. As I said, sevens. I think there's a smashing of people across.
Could it also be a shop window then for those 4 out of 10 players playing?
Absolutely. Well, that was one of the things that the Tens was doing, is that they're aiming to hold, not so much just drafts, but also opportunities for players to come and train and have an opportunity to put themselves forward to be selected for it. And they were thinking of having these combines, and probably still are, not only at the States, which is where the investors were largely based, but across the world. And what if you're going to India ahead of hosting the next stage of the Tens in Delhi, and you do a combine and you're releasing 6 new players that you found that are ridiculous athletes from whatever they've been doing, but have barely, got familiar with the game. And you do that across the world and start to see these people coming through from areas that World Rugby, because ultimately it's about their relationship with about 7 or 8 rich unions and not too much genuine interest in the rest at times, it seems, then actually what could someone be doing in terms of really tapping into or untapped areas of the world in terms of where talent might lie to get on a rugby pitch, and that side of things I think is exciting, to be able to find people from new territories. 12s hasn't necessarily said it might do that, but all of that I feel that there are lots of areas like that the disruption is ripe for finding more on.
Yeah. No. I'd agree. I mean, look, I don't think we've ever gone the right way in rugby, have we? We've never necessarily made the right decisions. I mean, when we went professional, that was forcing the hand of clubs, and I think it was Frank Cotton at the time who'd suggest regions or counties, which actually might not have been a bad idea. So, who knows? And it is going to take a lot. You see, even like recently, Cardiff changing their name from Blues to Thing, and they couldn't even make that region as such work in a franchise format. So it takes a lot more. So they will have to base it around the cities, or they go to places. What's the biggest city that doesn't have a major sporting team?
Oh, is that a quiz question? I'm not sure.
That's a good quiz question for your next one. I can't remember who it was.
This one for the next quiz, Nick.
Yeah,
we'll find out.
Be some there. Like it could be, I don't know, Milton Keynes or somewhere.
Guildford.
But they've tried that, haven't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah. as an AFC Wimbledon fan, yeah, it's a sore subject. No, I think we've picked this apart enough. I think everything we need to do is now wait and see if Nick is right, and there's 3 or 4 other things like this lined up. Then it's going to be an interesting 12 months for the sport. Personally, I think I'd probably rather spend the money on the women's game and the grassroots game.
I would have liked to have seen that at the forefront. And it's interesting.
Invest into a sevens tournament where that's your Olympic bread and butter. That's
that's the other thing. So I think there's a lot of so much uncertainty about the sevens too that needs addressing. I think that's probably why another one coming out when those aren't addressed has sort of, it's unsettled people, isn't it? Really, I think that's what happens to people. They get unsettled when they see something. And from my side, it's fine to unsettle, but just do it with substance, and not with an old boy holding a random rugby ball and thinking we're going to get excited, But anyway,
cool. Well, I really appreciate your time, gents.
No worries.
Thanks for coming up with the idea, Alex, and Nick. Thanks for
catching up, Nick.
As
always.
Yeah, you too. Pleasure, boys. Enjoyable.
Are you on the World 12 circuit next year?
Yeah. See you in Milton Keynes.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that a sentence that anyone's ever really said?
Not even people who live in Milton Keynes.
Lovely. Cheers, chaps. We'll
take care, guys.
catch you all soon. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Bye.